All right, so we're diving into a presentation by Stephen Johnson from the Freedom Outpost.
Mm-hmm.
You shared this with me, and even Stephen himself said that the title Perspective, Position, Posture, and Power to Partner was, he even admitted it felt a little clunky.
Yeah, a little bit.
But the ideas in it, I think, are anything but.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm really interested to unpack it with you.
I think it's really interesting how right off the bat he connects this to the Book of Esther.
Yes.
Specifically focusing in on the 12th month as a time of transition from chaos to order.
Right.
And it's not just any order, though. It's a divine order.
Right.
Which I think is key to understanding everything that he's talking about here.
It reminds us that we're not just kind of stumbling through life reacting to things.
Right.
But there's this bigger plan unfolding.
Exactly.
And Stephen really challenges us to consider our place within that divine order.
Mm-hmm. And he emphasizes the fact that judgment always begins with ourselves, within our own lives. Before we even consider the big picture, we need to examine our own hearts and motives.
So let's dive into this idea of perspective.
Okay.
Which Stephen really contrasts with our culture's obsession with quick fixes.
Yeah.
He points out that God doesn't operate on our timeline.
Right.
Like, think about the Book of Esther. Those events unfolded over 9 years.
Yeah, and it's not even just about time moving slower for God, but it's recognizing that he sees the end from the beginning.
Right.
He's playing 4D chess.
Yes.
While we're focused on the very next move.
It helps explain why God's ways so often seem so unorthodox.
Right.
Completely outside our expectations.
Yes.
Imagine like a young Jewish woman becoming queen through a series of seemingly random events. It goes against everything our human logic would dictate.
But that's the beauty of it, right?
Yes.
Surrendering to God's plan, even when it feels uncomfortable or doesn't make immediate sense, it opens us up to possibilities we could never imagine on our own.
Absolutely. And Stephen connects this idea of surrender to the importance of starting with the end in mind.
Right.
He encourages us to constantly remind ourselves of the ultimate goal, God's plan for humanity.
Yeah.
It's not about our little agendas, but aligning our desires with his.
He uses that example of playing for revival in unconventional places, like prisons.
Yes.
It challenges our assumptions about what's normal.
Right.
And forces us to see the world through God's eyes.
So it's not just about having this far-off vision, but letting that vision shape our daily choices and actions.
Exactly. And that's where, daily devotional practices become crucial, as Stephen points out.
Yes.
We need that constant connection to the end goal.
Yes.
To keep us grounded and aligned with God's plan.
Now, here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Stephen says we're both a piece and a player in God's plan.
Yes.
He quotes Mordecai from Esther 4, reminding Esther that deliverance will come from another place, even if she doesn't act.
Right.
But her choice determines whether she and her family will be part of it.
It's such a profound concept.
It is.
It means we have a crucial role to play, even as we acknowledge that God is ultimately in control.
Yes.
He invites us into partnership.
Yes.
Not as puppets, but as active participants.
That's such a powerful distinction. And it leads us to Stephen's next point, position.
Okay.
He stresses that there are no accidents in where we find ourselves.
Right.
Each situation we're in comes with specific opportunities, dangers, resources, and connections, all orchestrated by God for a purpose.
And some positions, he suggests, are temporary.
Right.
Acting as stepping stones
Yes.
to the next stage in God's plan.
Yes.
He shares his own experience of being unexpectedly removed from ministry in Hong Kong,
Yes.
which at the time felt like a setback, but ultimately redirected him to where he is now.
It reminds me of those seemingly random encounters and events that looking back feel divinely arranged. It's mind-blowing to consider all the ways God might be working behind the scenes.
It is.
Orchestrating our steps, even when we're completely unaware.
And this brings us to the element of power.
Okay.
Which Stephen clarifies isn't about self-serving ambition.
Right.
But about the specific influence and opportunities available in each position we occupy. It's about recognizing the potential for impact within our current circumstances.
He uses the passage in Esther 8, where Mordecai, empowered by the king, writes an edict permitting the Jews to defend themselves.
Yes.
It's not just about raw power. It's about using the authority and influence we've been given to advance God's purposes.
What's fascinating is how Stephen connects this written edict to the power of God's word, what he calls the Rhema utterance. This refers to a specific spoken word from God.
What carries power to create and transform. He also links it to the power of testimonies,
Right.
highlighting how past victories can equip and empower us to act.
Like God provides us with both the sword and the shield,
Yes.
his word and the testimonies of his faithfulness in the past.
And with that power comes responsibility.
Exactly.
We have a choice to use it or not. And we're accountable for that choice.
Stephen doesn't shy away from the hard truth that many might choose comfort over courage. Suggesting that if the church today were in the same position as the Jews in Esther, only a small percentage would actually rise to the occasion.
It's a sobering thought, and it really challenges us to examine our own hearts.
It does.
Are we willing to step into the fullness of what God has called us to?
Yeah.
Even when it's risky or uncomfortable?
That's the question, isn't it? And he reminds us that complete victory may not be immediate, urging us to celebrate victories along the way while continuing to fight the good fight. That long game perspective is crucial for staying the course.
So we've covered perspective, position, and power, all within the context of God's unfolding plan.
Yes.
And now he introduces this idea of posture.
Right.
Which feels like the linchpin holding everything together.
It is, because you can have the right perspective, be in the right position, and even have the power to act.
Yeah.
But if your posture, your inner state is off, it can all go sideways.
Right.
So Stephen really defines posture as the attitudes and motivations that are driving us.
And he highlights some key aspects of posture, like compassion.
Right.
Using that example of Mordecai raising Esther as his own daughter, it's such a powerful image of selfless love and care.
It is.
The kind of heart we're called to cultivate.
Absolutely. And then there's obedience.
Yes.
You know, both Esther and Mordecai demonstrate a willingness to submit to authority, even when it's difficult.
Yeah.
You know, Esther risks her life to approach the king.
Yes.
And Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman.
Yeah.
Even though it puts him in danger.
That takes some serious conviction.
It does.
It reminds me of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
Declaring that even if God doesn't rescue them from the fiery furnace, they still won't bow to a false god.
Right.
Their faith isn't about getting what they want. It's about aligning themselves with God's will, no matter the cost.
Exactly. And that unwavering conviction leads to the most surprising aspect of posture, Stephen highlights. Joy.
Yes.
He references the celebration in Esther 8, which takes place before the battle against their enemies even begins.
Right.
It's like they're so confident in God's victory that they can't help but celebrate in advance.
It's a powerful reminder that our joy isn't dependent on circumstances, but on our relationship with God and our trust in his promises.
Stephen unpacks the Hebrew word simcha for joy, describing it as an inheritance and a right for those in covenant with God.
Right.
It's not just a fleeting emotion.
Yeah.
It's a deep-seated confidence and delight in who God is and what he's doing.
He cites verses from Psalms and Nehemiah that illustrate the power of the joy of the Lord, describing it as our strength. It's not about ignoring the hardships or pretending everything's fine.
Right.
It's about choosing to focus on God's goodness and faithfulness, even in the midst of trials.
And this brings us to the final and perhaps most crucial piece of Stephen's presentation, the concept of partnership with God.
Yes.
He uses the analogy of Aikido, a martial art where you use your opponent's energy against them.
It's a brilliant analogy. It's not about fighting against God or trying to force our own will, but learning to flow with his spirit and allowing him to work through us in ways we could never orchestrate on our own.
Stephen points out how this plays out in Esther. You know, Haman's elaborate schemes to destroy the Jews ultimately backfire, becoming the very means of their deliverance.
Yes.
It's a beautiful example of how God can turn evil intentions for good when we surrender to his plan.
It's a powerful reminder that God is the ultimate strategist. He's in control, even when it seems like chaos reigns.
And Stephen stresses that while it is God's decision, way, plan, timing, setup, and glory, it still requires our participation. He contrasts this with our culture's have it your way mentality, you know, urging us to surrender to God's plan rather than clinging to our own preferences.
He uses this hilarious anecdote about working at McDonald's to illustrate this point.
Yes.
You know, remember the customer who wanted their order their way?
Yeah.
And how it threw the entire system into chaos?
Yes.
It's a lighthearted way to emphasize the importance of lining ourselves with God's order, instead of trying to impose our own.
It highlights that tension between our desire for control and the freedom that comes from surrendering to a plan much bigger than ourselves.
So ultimately, we need to align our perspective, our position, and our posture.
Right.
To effectively partner with God. It's not about becoming perfect or having all the answers.
Right.
But about cultivating a heart that's willing to trust, obey, and persevere.
Yeah.
Even when things get messy.
And Stephen reminds us that God uses everything, even negative experiences, to bring about positive change.
Yes.
He shares how his own expulsion from Hong Kong, though painful at the time, ultimately triggered a chain of events that led to healing and restoration.
It's a powerful example of how God can redeem even our most difficult experiences and use them for our good and his glory.
He shares a quote from a bishop.
Okay.
Your comprehension is not a prerequisite for your participation.
Wow, that's good.
Right.
We don't have to fully understand everything to obey. Until next time, keep diving deep.